We've got a discussion now that's about, very vaguely about sound design, but I think we're going to roam over quite a few different subjects. It's customary at these sort of events for the chair to kick things off with a lame anecdote, so tonight's no exception. There's a lot of the panelists have connections with Japan, and I first became aware of the connection between design and audio things about 25 years ago, and I went to Japan on a press trip with a bunch of audio journalists, and they told me a story which could have been an urban myth, but about a Japanese audio fanatic who was very rich and had a house designed, and he basically had the house designed around his hi-fi system. And the loudspeakers in the living room were embedded in the wall, and these huge, very powerful magnets that you have to have in loudspeakers were sticking out the back into the kitchen. And it drove his wife mad, because every time she walked past with a handful of cutlery, the cutlery flew up and stuck to the magnets and was unable to remove it. So hopefully that will provide a very tenuous link into some conversation about sound design and the Japanese connection. Nick, you spend a lot of time in Japan. Your wife's Japanese, yeah? You've been recently there launching this, Musicity, in Tokyo. Tell us a bit about that.
So yeah, Musicity is it's basically an app, and the idea is that you go to different locations and you stream music at locations. The music is created especially for the project, and the music is designed by artists who have an affinity with that location. So it's all about, location and music. And we launched that in Japan last year. Simon and myself, we work on the project together. And we've launched it in London today as well, actually. There's a track from Laura J. Martin, which you can get through the app today. And she's playing live a little bit later on. So it's a kind of music and architecture project.
Okay, and you've made some very good connections in Japan, I think, haven't you, through the project, yeah?
Yeah, Ryuichi Sakamoto has put a track together for us, which I've been a huge fan of his for years, so I think it's incredible that he's involved in it. And we've got some good people working on it. We've got a big festival coming up as well, so it's going well.
And Michael, you work in Japan too. Can you just introduce yourself? Tell us about your consultancy, Sound Strategies, and what your Japanese connection is.
Sure. I won't do it in Japanese, though. I could do. I do go to Japan a lot, and I've been going there for about 28 years, in fact. I run a consultancy which works in cultural enterprise, which has all sorts of different connections and tasks. So I can work in the arts, I work in sound, I do a lot of work with brand managers, I do a lot with arts education, so it's a pretty broad brief. I was head of education at the Royal Opera House, I was a member of the London Symphony Orchestra at one point, so I've come with a background very much as a player. And my fascination with Japan is in many different areas, but particularly their use of sound over there. They have a different sensibility for the use of sound, and in fact, one of the ministries has determined 100 sounds which are typically Japanese, and it can go from wind chimes or these little ornaments they put in gardens which frighten deer away, but a lot to do with water. And for example, the wind chimes they use to give that sense of cooling in the summer. So there's a whole gamut of sounds that they employ throughout their society.
And is that in effect using sound as a kind of national branding, an element of the national branding of Japan?
I don't think it's a conscious thing, but there is undoubtedly a brand that is Japan which is to do with sound, whether it be the koto or which is they call it a harp. It's not really, it's just a set of strings across a box. But the koto or the shakuhachi, which is a kind of flute, those sorts of sounds, if you hear them on a movie track, you'll automatically think you're in Japan, without question.
So there's a very explicit connection between the sound and the environment there.
Very much so. Yeah. And interesting how they take those natural sounds into the most unlikely places. You'll be on the 50th floor of a skyscraper somewhere, and you'll hear a bird singing, but very subtly, I've seen it done in hotels, actually, and people think that a bird is caught behind the curtain somewhere. But it actually, the way it's done in Japan, it gives you a completely different sense of what's happening. And in all the restrooms as well, they have these natural sounds and water running and things like that. For all sorts of reasons, they use it, actually, to hide other sounds.
Okay.
And, but yes, it's extraordinary the way that they utilise it.
Ab, I don't know if you have a Japanese connection, but if you can introduce yourself briefly and tell us a bit about your relationship with sound and design and environments.
Yes. Well, I think the whole thing of masking sounds in toilets is fascinating. I run an interior design practice, and we use sound as an additional layer in order to kind of create a more dynamic or more sensual space, depending what it is we're doing with the sound. In Little Chef, we made interactive urinals that would sing to you about food to try and get people to go and buy food after using the toilet, for example. We put soundscapes across shopping malls to get people more engaged in the environment, and have had the reverse effect where we sent them all to the toilet and they had to turn off the sound systems in Q8. But we've had more productive soundscape projects. We also work a lot with acoustic, trying to remove unwanted sound, trying to create intimacy in restaurants such as Pizza Express, where we created a collection of sound booths where you could play your own iPod above your table and not affect your neighbours. So we believe sound to be one of the senses that needs to be amplified within the environment of design.
Is there a kind of study of the psychology of sound in retail environments and public places? Because one of the things that I find incredibly puzzling is when you're shopping in supermarkets, very often the music is extremely melancholy and down mood. And I don't know, that doesn't make me feel like spending money at all. But
I think that's more about the lowest common denominator. I think
Okay.
is that I don't know. I mean, that's probably more someone else's area, but it strikes me as kind of lift music. It's there to send you to sleep whilst you're rising up, not really to sell. Whereas the smell of baked bread is quite good at getting you to buy bread.
Well, actually, there has been research into how sound can make people buy more. In fact, and it was done with wine. And they found that if you went down the German aisle and German music was playing, you bought more German wine. It was extraordinary that the study. So there have been a number of very basic things done around that. However, there is a big warning on that as well, because it's not just a question of playing this music ad hoc. It's the environment that you're actually building as well. And there's a major issue about the design of these environments, which are acoustically extremely challenging. So it's not just a question of bunging some music in and expecting it will work when you've got all sorts of other sounds and all sorts of other racket going on at the same time. So you have to start back at basic level. What is the design of our space?
But we're in that design process. Simon, maybe you can throw some light on this. In that design process, does sound get considered right from the get-go, or is it something that gets added on later on in the process?
I think fixed when it's gone wrong.
Sorry?
Yeah, no, exactly. As I think was just about to say, it gets added on when things maybe don't go as well as intended. It's never really part of the design mix at the very beginning, but I think it should be. We tend to look at kind of music, and the whole point with musicity, it's about adding that kind of layer to the experience of place. And I think it's something that there's a similarity between kind of architecture and music in the sense they both animate you as an individual. If you think about any other art form, if you see architecture as an art form, it's maybe a civic art, if you like. There's no other art form that animates you in the same way that music does and architecture does, physically, intellectually, and emotionally. So it's an important part of how we experience spaces and place.
But would it be unusual to have a sound designer in the sort of core team right from the start of an architectural or interiors project?
We personally always try and bring in an acoustician when we start a project, because I think it's so much more integral if it's there at the beginning. There was that incredible project in Poland with a name of a woman I could never pronounce. At this year's Venice Biennale, I mean, she designed the whole chamber was designed around the sounds that she wanted to create, and so you had the design, the architecture being led by the sound, almost like your Japanese sound system, which creates both an incredibly beautifully sculptural sound space and an extraordinary sounding space, which seems to be the best of both worlds in many ways.
But this is the exception rather than the rule, is it?
I think it is, yeah, definitely.
So what,
Yeah.
in effect, what you're doing with musicity is you're sort of adding the musical element in later. I mean, centuries later, in the case of some of the buildings that you've worked with. Yeah.
I thought you were going to say some of the artists then. Yeah, I think again, if you think about kind of placemaking, there's a fantastic quote that inspired us at the beginning of the project from Rem Koolhaas, the architect, who talked about architects being liberated from their obligation to build, to construct something. How do we go about creating a sense of place? And I think with musicity, what we're trying to do is add music as that layer. You know, if you start to look at the city, if you start to look at spaces through the lens of the artist, what does that mean? How do you respond to that?
Of course, the economic situation has liberated many architects from the
Liberating their obligation to do an awful lot. Yes, it's true. Apart from listening to a lot of music.
But the irony of Rem Koolhaas is he then creates a glass curtain wall in an opera house, which has to be then surrounded by curtains in order to have any kind of acoustic quality to it.
Completely, yeah. It was probably a provocative statement, I think, from Rem, which is sort of what he's known for. But yeah, I mean, if you look at I'm not actually an architect, although I run a firm of architects. The kind of conceptual heart of architecture is space, but for me it's experience, and that's again what we're trying to do with musicity as a music project. Again, if you think about how music animates you, it's the same really for me in terms of architecture as well.
Nick, perhaps you could give us an insight into how you commission music for very, specific, sometimes historical buildings, that have a very specific, space and experience of going through them. How do you brief a musician?
It's going to be a very disappointing answer, unfortunately, because all the musicians, when we told them about the project, they just wanted to get involved, and they all selected their own location.
Okay.
So they kind of, then a lot of them went to the building, and maybe some of them recorded effects at the location, just took field recordings. Others just kind of used their memory to kind of, to get an association with the place and created music around it. So it's a pretty straightforward process, to be honest, and it was more about presenting the opportunities to the right musicians, I think.
Okay, so it's more about the matchmaking, yeah?
Yeah, definitely.
Simon?
I think it's very much about kind of an open brief to the artists to see how they respond to the city. It needs to be something quite kind of meaningful in terms of their response. And actually, we quite like the idea that the response could be quite abstract. It doesn't have to be about the building itself. It could be about a mood, a feeling. So long as we can kind of locate it, it doesn't really have to be a physical kind of constructed building, if you like.
I think one thing we've got to remember is that music is personal, and everybody's got a different opinion about what the music or what the soundscape is. And that is one of the biggest problems when you're actually designing any sort of soundscape in which you want to try and make connections with large groups of people. We worked for Intercontinental Hotels for 2 years on a big project, and part of that was a global survey we did of a number of their sites. And it was interesting what fed back, because there were people there who were looking for an experience similar to home in some sort of ways. When we did the survey, it was extraordinary. We found that 47% of the people we interviewed globally said that they thought that the sounds they heard in a hotel were deadly. Ghastly was some of it, and it was extraordinary, because you'd say to the general managers, if 47% of your clients said your fine dining was ghastly, would you be happy about it? And it was a whole experience, whether it was you're sitting in the reception area and there was these ubiquitous water features you get, which actually, the way they're turned on, it's like Niagara Falls sometimes. You can't hear. Sometimes they hide conversations and they're meant to do so. Other times they just invade. And I remember there was one hotel that was built in San Francisco, which we were involved in, and there was a lot of publicity went around this, and they had the best chef in, terrific restaurant. They wanted to put the music in there. We helped them with sorting all that out. And then everything went wrong. And they said, it was the fault of the music. Well, it wasn't actually. It was the fact that they put cheap speakers in. They put them in the ceiling, pointed at the floor, and it was a marble floor. And they actually dumbed down on all the acoustic treatments and everything. So really, you're on a loser there if you actually try and put any sorts of sounds in there. And it is personal.
But I mean, I would argue that's true of any type of design to an extent. Design is entirely personal, as is in the taste of food. I think sound is only an extension of that. And clients continuously try to dumb down detailing or cut things out in order and as a result end up with an inadequate space, functional lighting, sound. These are all just different layers of the same elements.
I think there's a yes and a no to that, actually. We can always close our eyes and we can't close our ears. And sound is always with us. And and it's invasive. And it moves from room to room and it travels. And, if we were in a different room, we won't see what's in the next room, but we can hear it. And it's a big issue about sound and how we deal with it because of that.
I was listening to something on Radio 4 a couple of days ago about the difference between just hearing and listening. And do you get the feeling sometimes with your corporate clients that it's a sense that they sort of ignore, they just don't hear? Like the hotel owners, they just don't hear what the ambient sound in the hotel is.
Well, I don't think generally that people have an awareness of the acoustic properties of spaces anyway. Right. But, I mean, whenever we work with people, there are two things we deal with. We deal with context and purpose. And you may want a space where people are just happy with chilling out. You may want a space where people really want to listen to things. So, you've got to work out what the aim of is, what you're trying to do with this sort of space, I feel.
So it's about your sense of purpose. It's about what you're trying to achieve.
I think so, and that can change. And that's what I was saying earlier. One of the nice things about live artists is the fact that they can change according to circumstance.
But surely the technology must be available. I mean, you can have responsive lighting, for example, that changes with time of day, purpose of the room, etc. Can you not do that? You must be able to do that with sound.
Well, I suppose we already, to a certain extent, have that with mobile phones. We can individuate our experiences through music of kind of spaces, I guess. I mean, if you think about how we use mobile phones with music, in a sense, everybody's become an architect. It's about creating a space in terms of the way in which you mediate your relationship with spaces and buildings. So I suppose in that sense, we already have it. And I think there's something kind of quite nice about it not necessarily being prescribed, not something that's been kind of delivered from a top-down way. It's up to the individual to respond through their choices of their own individual music.
And yet, if you're talking about a building like a hotel, it's a public, it's a public shared space.
Sure.
And this is where that sort of notion of individuality becomes more tricky. Yeah.
Well, it is. It's different spaces. You do have the public spaces, but you have the private spaces as well. And how do you handle those? And we were talking about how do you take that sense of sound as well as the smells from the spa, for instance, back to your room with you. How would you deal with something like that? How do you make that a very personal environment? How do you allow people that sense of choice, where in other areas of the hotel you couldn't necessarily do that? So how do you deal with that? I mean, the big problem people find with sound in general is that they can't control it if somebody has made those decisions for them.
Which is why I like Ab's idea of the booths in Pizza Express where you just plug your own music in. How did people respond to that? Did they like that? Did they know how to use it? Could they figure it out?
I think people love any opportunity they can do to personalise their space, and particularly sound is so generational of the moment. To be able to play their song when they're going to propose to someone that they've chosen, or to have a separate party from the person next door to them, even though they're all open and viewable, I think is excellent. I mean, going back to your earlier question, you can have technology that can change the way the sound is projected, but you can't change the environment and the sound is received in. And sound, every room, every space has its own particular, acoustic frequencies, and the materials around it relate to that. And I think that's what's really interesting, and that's what we're being very slow to catch on to. Trying to create spaces which have particular frequencies that we want to use or to deny or to celebrate.
And is that, for you, was that part of your design education, or is it part of design education, or is it something that you've had to kind of pick up and learn yourself through your own practice?
It's part of acoustics education. For me, design is about the senses, and it's about stimulating the senses. And so to ignore sound is to ignore eyes, is to ignore smell. They all must be incorporated, and they all have different properties and different, easier and harder parts to control. But once you paint a red wall, it's red, and you can't make it white without repainting it. If if the song is wrong, you can change it or fade it or play with it. So there's a fantastic ephemeralness to sound, which is, which is all engaging in a way.
Simon, in terms of your architectural education, was sound an integral part of that, or is it something you've had to learn about yourself?
Something I've had to learn, I think, and introduce to the processes that we bring into play when we are designing spaces. Again, very much, I think, born out of the idea from my own personal view that architecture isn't about passive spaces, it's about active spaces. It's about the experience that effectively you're choreographing or organising through the design process. So yeah, absolutely, as Ab says, it's about stimulating all of the senses, and sound clearly is an important
And
aspect.
are clients open to that? Do you find that clients get it, or is that a big... again, is that another educational process that you have to go through?
It's probably a bit left of centre when we introduce it as an idea, but the kind of clients that we have, the Nikes and the Googles and the Red Bulls of this world, tend to be a little bit more open-minded, I guess.
Right. Well, they already have relationships with music
Completely.
in other ways, so it
Yeah.
would be maybe natural to bring it into the retail environment, yeah?
Completely.
Michael, you're smiling.
Well, you see, our premise is whenever we work with any clients is, isn't silence nice? And we work from that, basically, because, we have these challenging environments we have to face all the time, and they get louder and more invasive. And, it's when you get asked, what sound would you put in here? You say, well, shall we try turning everything off and starting from there? Because we do need those spaces. And I think that the biggest crime has been committed by the music industry, making us believe that we have to have all this noise all the time. And it's sort of commercialized and commoditized, this art form of music and what have you, and it pumps it out. And I think we actually start to lose our critical faculties because we actually have so much of it sometimes.
Well, there was a story, probably another urban myth, about Ralph Hutter, one of the founders of Kraftwerk, that he used to drive up the Autobahn with a blank cassette in the tape player on his car dashboard. Just for a couple of hours of no music, no sound, yeah?
Well, there's a friend of mine, actually, who recorded 4 minutes 32, 4 minutes 32, 4 minutes 32, and was actually trying to sell it into some of these pubs for the jukeboxes, so at least people could buy silence.
This is the John Cage piece, which consists of silence, yeah. Yeah. Although you have to have somebody sitting at the piano, don't you? Isn't that sort of part of the performance?
Well, you do, but I mean, that's a whole different philosophy behind that and his treatment of silence, which is really intriguing. So it's not quite as simple.
Did they get
as
it onto the jukeboxes? Did he get it anywhere into the pubs?
No, but actually they sold a lot of the CDs.
Oh, really?
They really did.
There was another movement a couple of years ago, wasn't there, where people were, once these sort of internet-connected jukeboxes started going into pubs and you could basically access any track, there was a sort of thing of putting on very ambient Brian Eno tracks over and over again and just completely winding up the clientele of sort of working class pubs. It was kind of a bit of guerrilla action, yeah.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because actually what we found with a lot of these places is that, hotels particularly, but I've seen it a lot of other places too, is they forget that they have staff working there. And so you get somebody in who designs this soundscape. And I went to one hotel, it's in Paris, a top-class 5-star hotel, and we were there at 11 o'clock one Thursday, and I went back there at 11 o'clock on Thursday 6 months later, and it was the same piece of music that was playing. And you can think, how do the staff survive in that situation?
And are there negative uses of sound in environments? Use sound to terrorize people or get rid of people or move people along. Like, Nick, you're a DJ. You must be familiar with the crap, slow 80s ballad at the end of the evening that clears the room.
Yeah.
You must have done that sometime in your youth, yeah?
Yeah, no, I'm quite guilty of doing that quite often, actually, clearing dance floors. But, yeah, of course, there are definitely good pieces of music you can play at the end to kind of disperse people. But I like to think that's called being quirky. But
yes,
no,
that's quirky rather than aggressive.
Michael, there have been studies done about this, and some of the tube stations in London, you will find them playing classical music, and they've found that there's been a reduction in crime in those areas. There was some studies done in Copenhagen and in Australia. They've also used music to shift these sort of itinerant news away from late night off licenses sometimes, things like that. And there was something called a mosquito, wasn't there? They put high pitched whine, which sent because only the teenagers
only
could hear
teenagers could hear and adults couldn't hear
they
it.
drove them away.
Yeah.
But actually, it's interesting what Mozart will do.
Well, they play classical music at Brixton Tube and Euston Square. It absolutely changes the atmosphere. Definitely changes the vibe. But has sound ever been used as an instrument of terror or of torture?
Yeah.
Yeah. Simon said David Guetta.
Well, when they were trying to get Noriega out of his hideaway, and they had helicopters flying over with these big speakers, and they were just blasting him with sound to get him out.
They do on the border of North and South Korea, don't they? I read as well. So the South Koreans pump music across, like instead of bombing them, they're bombing them with kind of music, culture, that kind of...
Bad music.
Well, I don't know. Yeah, good point. I've never been there, but yeah.
There's that great project where they fly around in a hot air balloon playing sounds in the moment of your sleep when you have rapid eye movement to affect your dreams. It's a Bristol artist, I can't remember his names, and he knocks on the doors and he interviews the people of how it's affected their dreams, and lots of exciting things come out, I do believe.
That's great. I've got a friend who lives on the flight path into Heathrow on the Welsh border, and he can pick up on his radios at night the signals from inside British Airways flights. So he was woken one morning at 5 a.m. by the voice of a very camp British Airways steward going, "Can I please have some vegetarian breakfast back here in economy?" So you can have that sort of accidental sound that, comes into your...
The secret lost messages that float around the environment.
What about that relationship between kind of, not between music and environment, but the sort of spoken word, the, fragments of dialogue, that kind of thing? Have you worked with that kind of material?
Yeah, we did a big survey of websites. We called it Web Audio Research. War. We went to war, in fact, with it. Because of the use of sound on the internet, and we were commissioned actually to look at a lot of the financial services websites. And interesting that out of all of them, it was First Direct that got all the accolades from us because of the way that they use the voice on there. And there was something extremely reassuring. It was done by accident. It wasn't done by design. And it was actually to do with economies as well, because they're actually based up in Leeds. And they had all these northern voices, all these Yorkshire voices, talking about investing or where you want to put your money and things like that. And there have been studies done about accent as well, and how it affects people's connections that they make, whether it's to buy or relationships, all those sorts of things.
So some are reassuring and some are less so. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Northern's good?
Northern is very good.
Scottish, they use a lot of Scottish voices on financial services ads as well, don't they? Yeah. Yes.
Welsh doesn't score very highly. The Welsh accent doesn't.
Really?
That's a fact. It's extraordinary. And other accents around. It's interesting. There's a lot of big study that was done about it. And what's interesting now, particularly, how regional accents have become more common in broadcasting, and they in themselves are reassuring, and it gives a sense of place. In fact, we have that regionality, whereas it's not just BBC pronunciation as it used to be.
What's that? Oh. It's 6 o'clock. Do we have time for questions, if anyone has any, or do we need to wind it up? We can go on. Okay. I think probably that would be a good point to open it up to the floor. Yeah. Has anyone got any questions of the panel? Any questions? No?
Is there anybody there?
Okay, why don't we finish off with just a comment from each of the panel on where you think the future is of sound and environment, sound and interior environment. Yeah? Simon.
I have absolutely no idea.
Come on. What about from a branding point of view? You work with a lot of big brands, you work with a lot of global brands, brands that want to be at that sort of cutting edge of culture as well as just flogging stuff to people.
Sure.
Do you see more sound coming into those environments in different ways?
Well, again, again, I think, as Abe touched upon before, it's really about finding ways in which you can use or engage all of the senses. I mean, I think just finding ways in which we can kind of create environments that are just more stimulating, less passive, and more engaging. I think if music is part of that, then I think we'll see more of it.
Well, it's a highly engaging art form, so it ought to work.
Yeah.
Emotionally. Michael.
It's actually not so much of where it's going to go, but it's a wish, actually, of what I would like. And I think that we have to start looking at our environments and the sounds that we use in them, because it really is becoming incredibly challenging now, the sort of environments. And we see people with these white cords coming out of their ears going over London Bridge, shutting the noises out from outside, but making their own sort of environments. And actually what's happening is everything else is getting louder. I spoke a couple of years ago, I did a TED talk for WWF International. I was talking about sound and sustainability, and I made some comments there about how young people in particular, because there is this gravitation towards cities, that they are losing the connection with the natural sounds around them. And I think we lose that sense at our peril. And these over-technical sounds and these challenging environments now, I think that the future for young children in particular, and it's very sad.
Thank you. Nick?
Yeah, I was going to say that I keep reading about how through technology we're masking the sounds around us now. So there's some pretty clever stuff out there that will actually, so people who live near motorways, I think you can kind of get technology now that kind of suppresses the sound. And I think that suppression of because that is our natural environment, the city has that as a natural sound. So yeah, I think maybe we're going to kind of have a lot more artificial sound that's, more bird song in Japanese toilets, for example, there's going to be a phase of that for sure.
Thank you. Ab?
I think the future is about creating spaces which reflect sound and play with sound and flirt with sound. More than that.
Okay. Thank you very much. Right, if you could give our panel a round of applause. Some nice volume, please. Big sounds. Thank you very much, and thank you all for your time. Have a good evening. Thank you.